Life on the Edge, Working the Rock Mines and Living with a Fugitive by J.D. Miller. About 25 years ago, when I was 21, I left southern Indiana, chasing a dream of adventure. I wanted to be a hero, a bronc buster, a mountain man. So, I headed west to Montana, only to discover that the Sioux and the Crow had long abandoned the windswept plains, the wild horse herds were gone, and there was no buffalo left to hunt. With my romanticized notions of the West quickly dashed, I took the first job I could find, working at a sawmill. It was grueling, soul-killing work. For 9 or 10 hours a day, I trudged behind a carriage on a band mill, my brain dying a little more every minute. I stuck it out for 8 months before finally making some connections that led me to training horses and mules. Through those contacts, I ended up in south-central Washington, working on a cattle and hay operation. It wasn't a massive ranch by some standards, but cutting 1,200 acres of alfalfa 5 times a year and running about 350 head of cattle, plus feeding and calving another 450 head in the winter, kept us busy. The Yakima Valley was high desert, dotted with sagebrush, irrigation ditches, and endless open space. We'd trailer horses out and ride for hours, checking on the newborn calves and giving them shots. But that's a story for another day. After some time, I started getting homesick. I missed Indiana, but instead of heading straight back, I stopped in Montana first. My buddies, sons of the ranch owner I worked for, helped me pack up and drive 420 miles to western Montana. We pulled into a place called Pioneer Junction, a rundown crossroads with a few dilapidated buildings. The houses were barely standing, roofs caving in, porches sagging. The only place to stay was a crumbling old hotel, and behind it, a row of tiny, one-room motel-style apartments with outside doors. I rented one for $250 a month, unloaded my stuff, and watched my buddies drive away back to Washington. That night, feeling alone in that eerie little town, I noticed a bar across the street. Big old Indians, loggers, and mountain men shuffled in and out. When I finally turned in for the night, I pulled my old .45 Colt Ruger Blackhawk from my saddlebags and slid it under my pillow, just in case. Sure enough, in the dead of night, someone started banging on my door. The room was pitch black. My heart pounded as I reached under my pillow, easing out my peacemaker. I tiptoed to the door and eared the hammer back, click, 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 click. The sound of that .45 going to full cock thundered in the silence. The banging stopped instantly. Whoever was out there knew that sound, and fool or not, they weren't willing to test their luck. The next morning, I figured it was time to find work. The rock mine and the hard life. After lollygagging for a couple of weeks, I heard about a rock mine about 80 miles away. My buddy Jonathan and I loaded up my old '94 Jeep Sport, an ex-Forest Service rig with a spotlight, and hit the road. The driveway to the mine was something else. It went straight up the side of a cliff. As we watched a truck ahead of us attempt the climb, it lurched and lost traction, sliding back down the road several feet before catching again. A couple of times, I was sure he was going to go over the edge and tumble 500 feet into the Clark Fork River below. Somehow, he made it. Leaning forward like that would help balance the truck. I turned to Jonathan and said, "If we try this, we're gonna be walking home tonight." Still, we climbed partway before deciding to hoof it the rest of the way up. The owner of the mine was looking for workers and hired us on the spot. Our job? Bust rocks out of the cliff and stack them into pallets. He gave us rolls of 2x4 wire, showed us how to wrap it around the pallets, and told us he'd pay $80 per stacked pallet. Sounded easy enough. It wasn't. Stacking a single pallet took the better part of a day. But the real kicker? He only paid when he sold the rock. Problem was, he rarely sold any. After 6 to 8 weeks, we were broke and starving. We hadn't eaten in 3 or 4 days when I finally told Jonathan, "We gotta get some food." We wandered into the Dollar General, hatched a half-baked plan. Jonathan would call the cashier outside for help with something, and while she was distracted, I'd snag a jar of peanut butter and run. We weren't thieves, we planned to come back and pay later. So, that's exactly what we did. For the next month, we lived on peanut butter and jelly. Eventually, we made enough money to go back and settle our debt. The cashier looked at us like we were insane. We just paid and walked out. Living with a fugitive when I could no longer afford my motel rent, I moved in with my
Daryl.
Before that, I had spent a little time living at an outfitter's house while he was away for the winter. That was an adventure in itself. He had a lynx tied to a doghouse in the yard that I had to feed every day. The damn thing would ambush me if I wasn't careful.
Daryl.
A good guy, but his wife, Amy, was different. She always wore long dresses and braided her hair, like she was trying to blend in as Mennonite or Amish. She was also convinced the government was after her. While sleeping on their couch, I heard movement. Cracking an eye open, I watched Amy walk past me, completely naked except for a pair of 4-inch heels. She went to the kitchen, got a drink of water, and walked back without a word. At 21, I wasn't exactly experienced with naked women walking past me in the dead of night. It took a while to fall back asleep after that. Later, I found out she wasn't just paranoid, the FBI really was after her. She was on their most wanted list. She had spent the last decade fleecing every company she worked for, stealing identities and scamming people out of thousands. We learned fast that working on a 500-foot cliff above the Clark Fork River, right on the Montana-Idaho border, wasn't for the faint of heart. It was nothing for the wind to whip up the canyon at 65 to 70 miles per hour, blasting across the river, slamming into the bluff, and roaring up the cliffside. More than once, I saw one of my buddies clutching a cedar tree with both hands, feet stretched straight out behind him, completely airborne. If they had let go, that would have been the end of them, gone like a lost kite, the last glimpse of them disappearing around the bend of the river, 400 feet above the water. Luckily, no one ever let go. Eventually, the wind would die down, and they'd drop back onto solid ground like a tattered flag settling back against a flagpole. But those gusts were strong enough to rip the gloves right off your hands, sometimes even a boot. Preventing frostbite was a full-time job, and keeping warm felt like a battle we were always losing. Daryl looked kind of shaken when I asked him how he spelled his name. With R, he said. For some reason, about a month later, I asked him again. I had forgotten his first answer, and this time, he told me, I spell it with a Y. At the time, I didn't think much of it. It was just one of those weird little things you notice, but don't dwell on. Later though, when I found out the truth, it all made sense. Meanwhile, Doug's wife, Amy, had started working at a business in town. She was quick, smart, and ambitious. Within no time, she had been promoted and was practically running the place. She started coming home later and later. Sometimes not at all, claiming they were just too busy. Daryl didn't seem to mind. But before long, it was obvious what was really going on. Amy and her boss were spending a lot of time together. He was a wealthy man in his late 50s, she was in her early 40s. Daryl never said a word about it, and I wasn't about to bring it up. That winter was brutal. The wind howled up the canyon, blasting snow straight up our pant legs and packing it into our underwear like nature's cruel joke. We'd come staggering in after a long day of stacking rock, frozen stiff, only to find out, again, that we hadn't been paid that Friday. By that point, I was beyond sick of peanut butter and jelly. When you eat it exclusively for 6 weeks straight, you start hating it in a way that's hard to put into words. Sometimes, if I managed to get a few dollars from my paycheck, on the rare occasions we actually got paid, I'd go to the gas station and buy a pack of cheese crackers for 25 cents. Those stale, dry little crackers were a real treat after nothing but peanut butter and jelly. The job itself was brutal. It was a 71-mile drive to work, followed by a half-hour climb up the cliff. At the top, we had to haul massive boulders out of a cave and use a 2-pound maul and chisel to split them into usable pieces. Some days, I wasn't sure if I was in a Montana rock quarry or a chain gang in Arkansas. Funny enough, my stories have always been influenced by Patrick McManus, who wrote comedy pieces for Outdoor Life for years. I always admired his storytelling, and it just so happened that the cliff where I worked was only 6 miles from his house. Unfortunately, I never got the chance to meet him. Eventually, the mine owner must have noticed how gaunt and lean we were getting, because he started buying pizza every Friday. After months of barely scraping by, it felt like a feast. By March, though, I was sick, run down, exhausted, and just plain done. I was supposed to start working for Jolly Jack in mid-April, but I hit my breaking point. One day in late March, I threw in the towel. "Screw it," I said. "I'm done." The very next day, I talked to Carter. He told me to come up early and stay with him until I started the new job. So, I packed up and moved out there, spending a week or two just settling in before I began riding mules every day. We had about 30 head, some greenbroke, some barely started, and a few that were just plain stubborn. It was shaping up to be a whole new kind of adventure. At some point, before I officially started riding, I had moved out of Daryl's place. Carter's place wasn't far from there, though, so I still saw Daryl from time to time. He always had his little motorhome parked behind his house, gassed up and ready to go. A privacy fence hid it from view, but if you knew where to look, you could see how easy it would be to yank out a couple of screws, slide that fence aside, and haul us out of there. I once asked him about it. He just shrugged and said, "Well, you never know. The government, man." At the time, I figured he was just another one of those paranoid types. But then, one night, we heard helicopters flying low over the ranch, spotlights sweeping the ground. And that's when all hell broke loose.
I jumped in my Jeep and tore down the hill, trying to figure out what was going on. Then, out of nowhere, I saw
Daryl
past me in that little motorhome. Pedal to the metal, smoke rolling out the back, his eyeballs as big as $50. He didn't even slow down. "What the hell?" I muttered, watching as he whipped up Bear Creek Road. He took the first turn, and I knew exactly where he was headed, the Yacht. That was the only place to go if you were running. The Yacht was 400 miles from everywhere, buried deep in the sticks. Even the FBI wouldn't chase you up there. At the time, I didn't know what was going on. Later, I found out the truth. Amy had done what she always did, played her boss like a fiddle. Just like every other company she'd ever worked for, she had ingratiated herself, taken control, and was likely setting him up for a big haul. But this time, someone recognized her. Somebody realized she wasn't just a smooth-talking woman with ambition. She was on the FBI's most wanted list. One phone call later, and the feds came in with helicopters to take her down. But Daryl, sharp as ever, caught wind of it just in time. He grabbed his go-bag, hit the gas, and disappeared. I didn't hear from him for years. When I finally did, I learned they never actually wanted him. It was all about Amy. She had spent the last decade scamming businesses and stealing identities under the name Amy Harrison. But her real name? That was a different story. Turns out, her real husband was named Daryl, Amy Harrison's actual husband. And when she stole that identity, my Daryl had to take his name, too, to keep the lie going. That's why he acted so cagey when I asked how he spelled it. He didn't even have any real ID. He was just rolling with whatever name Amy had him using. Eventually, the FBI did catch her, 2 years later. She was sentenced to 10 years, though I don't think she served all of it. Probably got out after 4 or 5. And that, my friends, is the story of working on the side of a cliff over the Clark Fork River in Idaho, and unknowingly living with a fugitive. Daryl, though, he was a real guy, a sharp, intelligent man. I don't believe he ever broke the law himself. But Amy? She was something else. When she took a job, she took it, wringing it dry and leaving a mess behind. And that was just one chapter of life on the edge.
She was lit, man. She did whatever it took when she went to work for a company, and within a couple months, she usually fleeced them for a big haul. Well, there's more of that story, not about Daryl, but about the mule training, and I might get there one of these days. Thanks for reading. Peace out. Author, J.D. Miller.